So one of the big milestones within Bitcoin is trying to reach whole coiner status, trying to get to 1 Bitcoin. And I think that most people see it as unreachable. Most people kind of turn their brains off when they think of even trying to get 1 Bitcoin based on its current value today. So I came up with this thing on my channel a little while ago showing that instead of thinking about it as this big thing, one whole Bitcoin, just split it into chunks. And you actually don't need as much as you think to start with. If you just do 15 million, I'll bring it up here. Start with 15 million, go down to 14 million, 13 million, etc., until you get down to 6 million here, 6 million sats. And that's a grand total of 1.05 Bitcoin or 105 million sats. But as we were kind of talking through this, we found a big hole in it. And that hole is how much this is actually going to cost somebody to do this strategy, assuming that Bitcoin kind of continues on the same trend that it has been on for the last 10 years. So historically, I think there's a few different numbers float around in terms of the compound annual return of Bitcoin being 60, 50, 40, 30. We use 50 here just for kind of simplicity for clean numbers. And so we're going to show you what the result of doing this strategy with that type of return in the future and how much that is actually going to cost you. So Rajat, break this down for us here in terms of what this would cost somebody to follow that strategy.
So the first year you're buying 15 million Satoshis, 1 Bitcoin is 100 million Satoshis, so you're buying 0.15 Bitcoin. First year you're spending $12,750 on 0.15 Bitcoin. The price right now is 85,000. Second year you're paying 17,850 for slightly less Bitcoin. Third year you're paying 50% more for slightly less Bitcoin. Fourth year, same thing. 50% more for slightly less Bitcoin. Fifth year, sixth year. You keep doing that until at one point you're paying $196,000 for 6 million Satoshis. So in total, 1 Bitcoin, if you do it this way, is going to cost you $750,000. So keep in mind, it doesn't matter whether you bought Bitcoin in 2015, 2010, somehow you found out a way to get Bitcoin in 2005. I know that's not possible, but this is a joke. But let's say it doesn't matter when you bought the Bitcoin. All that matters is that you got to a certain amount of Bitcoin, whether it's 1 Bitcoin, 0.1 Bitcoin, 0.01 Bitcoin. All that matters is that you got to that amount of Bitcoin. 1 Bitcoin equals 1 Bitcoin. So whether you pay 750,000 or George, can you scroll down and just show the second method?
Yep.
So whether you pay $750,000 for a Bitcoin or you try to lump sum your purchases, try to make them upfront, try to front load your purchases, you're going to be paying this way. So what you're doing is each year you're decreasing the amount of Bitcoin that you buy it by 33%, 33.333%. Price is still going up by 50% per year. Your purchases each year are exactly the same thing. With those same amount of purchases, so the same fiat value of purchases, you're buying significantly less Bitcoin each year. So what happens this year, this way, is you start off with 35 million Satoshis, then you get 23.3 million, then you get 15.5 million. Each year you're decreasing it by 0.33, so or 33%. And at the end of it, you get to 1.01 Bitcoin. But look at the cost. The cost is completely different. So this way, you get to 1 Bitcoin by 2032, and you're paying $238,000. So regardless of how you buy it, if you buy it this way or if you buy it the first way, you're getting 1 Bitcoin. But this way, you're paying like 75% less.
It's pretty remarkable, the difference. And one thing that I'll point out here is that dollar cost averaging is something that is taught and talked about as like a risk or like a risk averse strategy, something that, you know, gets you the average price over time, but you're buying the average price of an asset over time that increasingly goes up in dollar terms. So you're just buying it at a more expensive rate every single year. And this is shown really well with this spreadsheet, but it ends up making a lot more sense to just buy and hold. No, you're not going to get the bottom of the cycle or of the year or whatever. You're not going to get the absolute cheapest price, but over time, that is still significantly cheaper than if you dollar cost averaged over time. And you can see that by increasing the amount in this second example and lowering the years that it takes to acquire 1 Bitcoin. You can see it's, what is it, almost half as much, the cost?
It's a third, I think.
25%.
Oh, yeah. It's wild. Yeah, a third or whatever. And the other thing, too, that I'll mention here is just that the kind of the price between the year 27 and 28 is your actual price for that one Bitcoin. If you were to just buy one Bitcoin between the year 26 and 27, or sorry, 27 and 28 in this example. So you're still, and then at the end of 2032, Bitcoin's price here in this example is 1.4 million. So you're still significantly up on your purchase, even though you didn't do it in the most effective way. So what this really shows is that buying Bitcoin is going to increase your purchasing power. It really doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter, as we can see. This costs a third as much, so it does matter. But over a long enough period of time, you're still buying an asset for significantly less if you're continuing to buy it now into the future.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a pretty stark comparison there. You save about $500,000 by just taking a slightly different approach to it and kind of front loading this thing. I think it's important to note also that, this might be unattainable for a lot of people. That's $30,000 a year. There's not a whole lot of people who have that floating around. We're going to talk about that kind of closer to the end of this episode of how you can actually, find ways to get that. But you could scale this any way you want to. Not everybody's going to get a million. There's 60 million millionaires out there. I say this pretty much every show here, but I think it's important to kind of highlight that not everybody's going to be able to afford one Bitcoin. Don't make that your end all be all for it. You can scale this down to 0.1 of a Bitcoin, 0.01 of a Bitcoin, and take this exact same approach just on a much smaller scale. And kind of as we were talking about the DCA thing there, one thing I noticed about this strategy is that it actually is the average. You're still spending the same amount every year, right? And so I want to throw a little caveat in here for anybody who has the financial means to do it. This is probably going to be your best strategy. I'll make this up on the fly. So you get 100 million, you pay 85,000 1 year, and then you're done.
I was wondering where you were going with that.
It's we're still taking the average here. We're getting more sats off the start, less later on. But if you do have the financial means, clearly the best play is getting it right off the hop. That's kind of the moral of this episode, is like, try to get as much as you can, because when you look at this thing objectively, it is going to go up forever. And as you look at it, as you do the math on it on paper, you can see how hard it's going to be into the future, assuming, of course, that we do keep the 50% annual return, which could fluctuate. Some years you're going to get more, some years you're going to get less. This is kind of the average, but that is kind of the DCA way to do it. $30,000 a year for 8, and you get to 1 Bitcoin. So that's pretty cool. But we're not done. We're not done yet. Rajat's actually going to walk us through what most people would do here. Rajat, maybe kind of give your theory on why we decided to do the inverse of this based on most people's experience within Bitcoin, and how much more it's going to cost them taking that route.
So the way that I see it, I think most people are going to go with the opposite of that the first path that we told you guys. So the first path, you were spending, you were buying less nominally every year, but this way you're buying more nominally each year. So if you think about it, Michael Saylor did this. Michael Saylor bought a certain amount in the first year. Now their purchase, so in the first year, I think they bought 9,000 Bitcoin or 10,000 Bitcoin, something like that, or their first purchase. Now their purchases are like 50,000 Bitcoin. So they bought 55,000 Bitcoin once, I think. But the thing that most people do is, as they build conviction, they want to buy more. So what people do is they wait until they know more, until they are comfortable to buy more. That's exactly what I did. I'm sure that's what you guys did as well. But over time, what they do is they buy more and more because they become more confident, and they regret not buying it up front. So in this case, let's say there are people out there who have $1 million, $2 million, $5 million lying around. There are people like that. There are people who have $100,000 lying around, but what they're going to do is they're going to buy small chunks of Bitcoin. They're going to put 1% into their portfolio. Then they're going to convert that into 5%. They're going to convert it into 10%. What they're going to do is they're going to buy random rental properties. They're going to buy random index funds, all this random stuff that they really don't need. They're going to wait to buy Bitcoin and look at what the price to accumulate 1 Bitcoin here looks like. So it goes from, what was it in the first one? 753K. Second one was 236K. In this one, you're paying $1.3 million for 1 Bitcoin. You still have the same 100 million Satoshis, but in this case, you're paying 5 times more than somebody who front loaded their purchases. You're paying something like 13, 14, 15 times more than somebody who just purchased all of it up front.
Yeah.
It's pretty much $1 million difference, right? Like your strategy there was at 8 years, front loading it, 238,000 versus doing the opposite of that, the inverse. How most people do it is they accumulate more as they learn more about it. And by the time they figure out that this is the only asset that matters, it's costing them, 10x more. So that's $1 million difference there just because of that. So it does take a little bit more. I think it's hard for people who have like a lot of wealth in the old system to really buy into that. But I think when you do look at it objectively like this, and this isn't really our opinion on this. This is how Bitcoin is designed with a fixed bottom line. The supply is fixed. And so as more and more people figure this out, that top line, the demand will increase. And over time, as more and more people figure this out, that demand increases, supply doesn't change. It gets harder and harder to obtain these sats. And that's exactly what we're seeing with these objective spreadsheets.
I like to say in a lot of my videos, Bitcoin runs out at every price. And that's exactly what you see here. The amounts of Bitcoin that people want will run out at every single price. At one point, you could buy 1,000 Bitcoin for like $3. Today, it's costing you, how much is 1,000 Bitcoin? $100 million? So $3 versus 100 million,
Yeah.
or 85 million, or whatever. $3 versus $85 million. That's a massive difference. And most people are going to keep putting it off until they're completely priced out of certain denominations. So let's say right now, maybe people who are listening to this can easily get to 0.1. At some point, they won't be able to get to 0.01. And at some point, they won't be able to get to 0.001. It's just going to get more and more expensive. I think at some point, 0.001 Bitcoin is going to cost you $100,000. So if you can get to 1 Bitcoin ASAP, do it.
Yeah. Yeah, this is showing time. This is showing that the sooner you begin to understand Bitcoin, the sooner you build conviction, because you do have to have conviction to believe in this asset. You're probably not going to be used to the volatility of it if you're coming from money. You're probably used to a lot more stable short-term volatility assets, and you're going to have to just build some conviction around this asset. So begin to learn about it, start buying. Over years and years, you will not regret your choices.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that the one thing, we'll kind of wrap up here. We'll get our final thoughts. I think that the last thing that I would say on this is just understand that we go back to the supply and demand of this thing. I think it's important to really understand that as we see more individuals adopting this, as we see more countries adopting this, it is just going to get harder, because you have to understand that supply, that bottom line, let's just go with 21 million, even though there's 19.8 million available right now. Let's just use 21 million for simplicity. As that number at the top grows, as more and more people figure this out, though, there's going to be more people fighting for that amount of Bitcoin. And as that number continues to grow, as that number of people fighting for that same amount of Bitcoin, it's just going to get harder and harder to get. So more of the story here is take what you have, turn it into Bitcoin. Even if you don't have a bunch in your savings, start converting some assets. What do you guys think about that in terms of like how somebody could actually go about doing this?
Depends what they have.
Sell your assets ASAP. That's all. That's what I would say. Yeah, it depends.
Sell your assets. If you have your assets locked into your home, you could do a HELOC, so extending your mortgage out and taking some of that equity back in the form of cash, swapping that into Bitcoin. You could use it as a savings account. Anything extra that you earn can go into Bitcoin. That's what I do. And because I've already sold all my assets, I've done that parts. That's step one. Step two is anything extra that you earn. So provide value to the world, and whatever else you get back, you can swap into Bitcoin.
Yep. I think that's a great episode, boys. What was the last thing that I wanted to say there? I don't know. I forgot about it. But anyways, moral of the story, get some Bitcoin while you can. Time is running out. Get to 1 Bitcoin. I think that should still be the goal. At this point, it might be very hard for people. But I forget what I was going to say there. Anyways, let's wrap this up. This is a great episode. I think this is a great way to think about it, boys. Once again, we got a QR code on the side of the screen there by Rajat's head. If you learn anything from this, yes, if you learn anything from this, you can send some sats very easily without anybody's permission, and we very much appreciate that. The last thing I was going to say, I just remembered it, is that, you know, if you are somebody who has a lot of assets in the old system and you don't really feel too comfortable putting a lot into Bitcoin, as much as we advise and advocate for people holding their own Bitcoin in self-custody, you can use a Bitcoin ETF. You're going to get the same price exposure without the risk of losing the Bitcoin off the start. That should obviously be transitioned over time into holding it yourself. But I think that's a really good way for a lot of people with a lot of wealth to get into Bitcoin, front load it, and without having to, you know, procrastinate and be worried about losing that Bitcoin. So that was the last kind of thing that I wanted to mention there. So thanks, fellas, and we'll catch you on the next one.